The sound of my mother's hand against my face was louder than the string quartet that had been playing behind us all night. For one full second, nobody in that ballroom breathed. 200 people in silk and tuxedos, champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips, watching the daughter of Charleston's most respected attorney get struck by her own mother in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress. My cheek was on fire. My bracelet had slipped off my wrist and landed somewhere near my sister's wedding shoes. And I remember thinking, in that strange, calm place your mind goes when something breaks permanently, that I had never felt more awake in my entire life. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Audrey Bennett. I'm 35 years old, I design homes for a living, and until that night, I thought I understood exactly what my family was capable of. I was wrong. But to explain how I ended up standing in a ballroom with a red handprint blooming across my face, I need to take you back 4 years to a rainy Tuesday evening in my grandmother's kitchen, because that's really where all of this began. My grandmother's name is Vivian. She's 79 years old. She taught constitutional law for almost 3 decades at a university here in South Carolina, and she has a way of looking at you that makes you feel like you're the only interesting person in the room. I used to visit her every week without fail, bringing groceries, fixing whatever had broken in her old house, sitting with her on the porch while she told me stories about arguments she'd won in courtrooms and mistakes she'd made in her own life. My mother, Cynthia, rarely came. My sister, Brielle, came even less. Neither of them seemed to think it mattered. But I didn't mind being the one who showed up. There was something peaceful about those evenings, something that felt like the only honest relationship I had left in my family. That particular evening, Vivian set down her tea and told me, quite calmly, that she'd changed her will. She was leaving me her townhouse on the Charleston waterfront, the historic one, worth over $2 million, the one she'd owned since before I was even born, the one with the wraparound porch where I'd spent every childhood summer I could remember. "Grandma, that's too much," I told her, genuinely stunned. "Give it to Brielle. She's the one everyone expects to inherit things like that." Vivian shook her head slowly, the way she did when she was about to say something she'd clearly already thought through many times. "Everyone expects Brielle to inherit things because your mother has spent 30 years making sure of it. I'm not interested in what your mother expects, Audrey. I'm interested in what's true." She reached across the table and took my hand in both of hers. "You're the only one who comes here because you want to, not because you're waiting for something from me. That matters more than you know." Then her voice changed, got quieter, more serious than I'd ever heard it. "When your mother finds out, don't let her convince you that love comes with a price tag. It doesn't. Not real love." I didn't understand the full weight of that warning yet. I would, eventually, and it would cost me more than I ever imagined. My mother found out about 3 weeks later. She didn't call to confront me directly. Instead, she invited me to Sunday brunch of her country club, the kind of place with cloth napkins and a view of the golf course. And when I arrived, my father, Thomas, and my sister Brielle were already seated, waiting with an expression that told me this had all been discussed without me long before I walked in. "We just want to talk about Grandma's estate planning," my mother said smoothly, sliding a leather folder across the white tablecloth. "There are some documents that need signatures, that's all." I opened the folder. Inside was a declination agreement, formal paperwork releasing my claim to the townhouse entirely. "I'm not signing this," I said. My mother's smile didn't move, but her eyes did. "Audrey, be reasonable. Brielle is starting her life. She and Grant will need a real home eventually, somewhere to raise children. You're single. You don't need a $2 million property just sitting there collecting dust." "It's not about need," I said, keeping my voice steady. Grandma made her choice. It's her house. Then don't blame me, my mother said quietly, folding her hands on the table in that composed lawyer's way she had. When what happens next? I didn't know what that meant yet either, but I started finding out within a matter of weeks. Clients I'd been courting for months suddenly stopped returning my calls. A developer I'd worked with for years told me, awkwardly over the phone, that he'd heard some concerning things about how I'd handled my grandmother's affairs. Concerning things. That phrase followed me around Charleston like a shadow I couldn't shake. I later learned my mother had been quietly telling people in her social circle, judges, doctors, business owners, the same people who came to her dinner parties every fall, that I had manipulated an elderly, vulnerable woman into rewriting her will behind the family's back, that I was unstable, that I couldn't be trusted with money or with people. My mother never once raised her voice at me in public during those months. She didn't have to. She simply made sure the right people believed the wrong things about me, one quiet conversation at a time. Around that same period, I noticed my grandmother acting strange. She got tense whenever my mother visited, her hands tightening around her teacup in a way I'd never seen before. She started locking important papers in a drawer in her bedroom, one she'd never bothered to lock before in all the years I'd known her. One afternoon, while helping her sort through old photo albums, I found a picture of a beach house on Kiowa Island, a vacation property I remembered visiting as a little girl, running through the dunes while the adults drank sweet tea on the porch. On the back, in Vivian's careful, deliberate handwriting, someone had written, "I never signed this." "Grandma, what does this mean?" She took the photograph gently out of my hands and slid it into the pocket of her cardigan without looking at me. "When the time comes," she said, "you'll understand." No matter how many times I asked after that, she wouldn't say another word about it. She simply changed the subject, pour more tea, ask about my work instead. 2 years passed like that. My mother and I barely spoke beyond obligatory holiday phone calls. Then, out of nowhere, an invitation to Brielle's wedding arrived in the mail. Thick cream cardstock with gold lettering, my name written in careful calligraphy. My mother called shortly after, her voice warmer than I'd heard it in years, talking about family and healing and how much it would mean to have everyone together again. For one foolish moment, sitting alone in my apartment, I let myself believe she actually meant it. Then, she got to the real reason for the call. "It would mean so much to us all," she said, "if you gave Brielle and Grant the townhouse as a wedding gift. Think of it as starting fresh, a new chapter for this whole family." "I'm not giving away Grandma's house, Mom," I said, my stomach already sinking. There was a long pause on the line. "Then don't blame me," she said finally, "for what happens at the reception." I should have listened harder to that sentence. I should have understood it wasn't a plea at all. It was a warning, dressed up in the language of family love. 1 week before the wedding, Vivian called me, and her voice had none of its usual warmth. It was sharp, urgent, the voice of a woman who had spent her whole career preparing for cross-examination and knew exactly how a room could turn on you. "Audrey, listen to me carefully. Don't sign anything at that wedding. Don't argue about documents, no matter what your mother says to you or in front of whom. If anything happens, anything at all, you call Jonathan Pierce immediately." She gave me the number twice and made me repeat it back to her both times. "Grandma, what's going on? What do you know that I don't?" "Your mother," she said slowly, each word deliberate, "has been preparing for that night longer than you realize." She wouldn't say more, no matter how I pressed, but something in the careful weight of her voice told me the townhouse had never really been the whole story. It was only the part I'd been allowed to see. The wedding day arrived bright and humid, the reception set up on a sprawling lawn overlooking the water, string lights strung between old oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. Before the ceremony even began, Brielle found me near the bridal suite, still in her dress, veil pinned half up, and asked me directly, without any greeting at all, "Did you bring the deed?" I stared at her, genuinely stunned. "You knew about this? About all of it?" "Audrey, Grant and I already planned to move into that house after the honeymoon. We've picked out furniture. We told his parents. Please don't make this difficult today of all days, not on my wedding day." "Needing something," I told her quietly, "doesn't give you the right to take it, Brielle." She turned and walked away from me furious, her veil trailing behind her like a flag of retreat. And I stood there alone for a long moment, realizing she genuinely believed her mother's version of events, that I was the greedy one, the difficult one, the sister who couldn't simply be happy for her on the most important day of her life. The wedding reception went beautifully for the first hour. The band played, the toasts were warm, and I almost let myself relax. Then my mother took the microphone. She talked about family, about sacrifice, about how proud she was to watch her daughters grow into strong, generous women who took care of each other no matter what. Then she smiled directly at me across the crowded tent and asked me to join her on the small stage set up near the dance floor. I should have refused right there. I didn't, because refusing in front of everyone felt like starting the exact fight she wanted. "Audrey has something wonderful to share with all of us tonight," my mother announced to the crowd of nearly 200 guests, her voice carrying warmly through the speakers. "She's decided to give Brielle and Grant the family townhouse as their wedding gift." The applause started before I could say a single word in response. She handed me a leather folder. Inside was the same settlement agreement from that brunch 2 years earlier, only now notarized, now formal, now sitting heavy in my hands in front of every important person my mother had ever wanted to impress in this city. "I never agreed to this," I said, loud enough for the microphone beside me to catch every word. The applause died out slowly, awkwardly. My mother's smile stayed frozen in place. "Audrey, sweetheart, you're just nervous. Sign it." "No," I said, steadier than I felt. "I'm not signing anything tonight." "You're embarrassing this family," she said, her voice tightening beneath the polished surface. "I'm not stealing from Brielle," I said, turning to face the crowd instead of her, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Our grandmother left me that house because I earned her trust over many, many years. That's not theft. That's a choice she made with a clear mind, and it deserves to be respected." That's when my mother's hand came across my face. I bent down and picked my bracelet up off the floor with shaking fingers. My cheek burned. 200 people watched me straighten my spine, look my mother directly in the eyes, and say the only thing I had left in me: "You just made this very easy." Then I turned and walked out of that ballroom, past the string quartet, past the stunned faces, out into the warm Charleston night. In the parking lot, my hands were trembling, but I didn't call a friend and I didn't cry. I called Jonathan Pierce. "I told you she used the settlement agreement in front of everyone. She slapped me, Jonathan." There was a pause on the line, and then he said, very calmly, "Then Vivian is ready." I didn't fully understand what that meant until my grandmother arrived less than an hour later, walking into the hotel lobby with her cane in one hand and Jonathan Pierce beside her, dressed as though she were about to argue a case in front of the state Supreme Court rather than confront her own daughter. My mother's face went pale the moment she saw her standing there. Vivian pulled me into a private room off the lobby, away from the wedding chaos still unfolding somewhere behind us. She looked at me with an expression I'd never once seen on her face before. Not sadness, not anger, something closer to quiet relief, as though a weight she'd carried for years was finally about to be set down. "Are you ready," she asked gently, "to know what your mother actually did?" I nodded, though I had no real idea what I was agreeing to hear. She told me that years earlier, Cynthia had secretly transferred ownership of Vivian's Kiowa Island vacation home using an old power of attorney document that had originally been signed for an entirely different, unrelated purpose. The property, worth over $1 million, had been sold quietly through a private buyer. The money had disappeared into accounts Vivian couldn't trace at first, moved through channels designed to be difficult to follow. When she eventually discovered the irregularities, she didn't confront her daughter right away. She was, after all, a woman who had spent her whole career teaching students never to make an accusation without airtight proof behind it. So she waited. She gathered records quietly, patiently, the way she'd once built cases for her students to study. Bank statements, property transfer documents, emails, including one Cynthia had accidentally sent to herself, discussing how to make the transaction look clean before Vivian could notice anything wrong. Witness statements from people involved in the closing, a forensic analysis of the altered power of attorney document itself. Jonathan had been quietly building the case alongside her for nearly 2 years, waiting for the right moment. The townhouse was never really about the townhouse, Vivian told me gently, her hand resting on my arm. Your mother was terrified that if I left you enough, you'd eventually start asking questions about Kiowa, too. Pressuring you to give it away wasn't only greed, Audrey. It was self-protection. She needed that house gone before you ever had a reason to look closer. We walked back into the reception together, side by side. My mother was still standing near the stage, trying to smooth things over with a cluster of stunned guests, when Vivian approached her, calm and utterly unshaken, and said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear clearly, "Cynthia, I think it's time you told everyone about Kiowa Island." My mother's composure cracked for the first time in my entire life. She insisted her mother was confused, that age was affecting her memory, that this was hardly the place for old family disagreements. But Jonathan stepped forward and confirmed, evenly and without a trace of doubt, that the evidence had already been submitted to investigators earlier that week. You could feel the air in that ballroom change all at once. The same people who had applauded my mother's speech 20 minutes earlier were now leaning toward each other, whispering behind their programs. My father admitted, quietly and painfully, that he'd known Cynthia was handling some property paperwork over the years, though he claimed he never truly understood the transaction was fraudulent. Vivian reminded him, not unkindly, that choosing not to ask questions is still a choice, and it still carries consequences. His marriage, from what I could see standing there that night, began unraveling in real time, right there on the dance floor. Brielle found me near the entrance afterward, still in her wedding dress, mascara streaked down her face in dark lines. "Some of that money," she whispered, her voice breaking, "helped pay for things growing up. My car, part of this wedding, maybe. I didn't know, Audrey. I swear to you, I didn't know any of this." I believed her. I still wasn't ready to forgive her that particular night, and I told her so, as honestly as I could manage. Trust isn't something you hand back the moment someone finally sees the truth clearly. But I didn't shut the door completely between us either. Not yet. The wedding didn't end in another dramatic scene. It simply quietly fell apart. Guests slipped out one by one, murmuring goodbyes. Grant's parents left early, visibly uncomfortable with everything they'd just witnessed. My mother stood alone near the stage where, less than an hour earlier, she tried to force me into giving away my inheritance in front of everyone she'd ever wanted to impress in this city. In the months that followed, investigators opened a formal case into the Kiowa Island transaction. My mother's reputation in Charleston's legal community, built carefully over 30 years of dinner parties and charity boards, began quietly dissolving one relationship at a time. I stayed out of the gossip entirely. I didn't need to spread anything or defend myself loudly. The truth did that work on its own, slowly and thoroughly. My career, strangely enough, began rebuilding itself, too. Not through pity or scandal, but through my own work, finally being seen clearly. A respected architect who'd witnessed the whole wedding reached out weeks later and offered me a partnership on a historic preservation project downtown, one of the most significant projects in the city that year. It became the biggest professional opportunity of my career, and it came from people finally seeing what I could actually do, instead of what my mother had spent years quietly telling them I was. My father reached out eventually, wanting to explain himself over coffee. I told him gently that if he wanted his daughter back, he'd need to prove it through consistency over time, not through a single apology. Brielle reached out too, several times, tentative and unsure. I didn't close the door on her, but I told her plainly, the way our grandmother might have, if you want to be my sister again, you have to be willing to know the truth, not just the version Mom always gave you. I asked my grandmother once, sitting on her new porch overlooking the water, why she waited so long to tell me everything. Why she let me walk into that wedding so unprotected. I could have shielded you from all of it, she said, looking out at the harbor. But I wanted you to learn that you could stand on your own 2 feet before you ever knew I was standing behind you the whole time. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my grandmother's townhouse, my townhouse now, watching the sun go down over the Charleston harbor in streaks of orange and gold. My studio is thriving. Vivian visits every Sunday, tea in hand, new stories ready. My relationship with my father is still uncertain, rebuilding slowly. My relationship with Brielle is still healing, one honest conversation at a time. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for my mother's approval to feel like I truly belonged in my own family. That house never really felt like an inheritance to me, not even after everything. Standing there that evening, watching the light spread gold across the water, it finally felt like something else entirely. It felt like freedom. If this story moved you the way it moved me to live through it, consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. We tell stories about the families who hurt us, the truths that eventually come to light, and the quiet courage it takes to stop shrinking yourself just to keep the peace at the dinner table. If you've ever had to choose between being liked and being honest, this channel is for you. And if there's one thing I want you to carry with you tonight, it's this. You can love your family without surrendering yourself to them. Boundaries aren't betrayal. Walking away isn't weakness. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do in a room full of people who claim to love you is simply refuse to sign. As for the deeper value in a story like this one, it's a reminder that healthy families are built on honesty, not obligation, and that real love never demands you erase yourself to keep it. It teaches that favoritism and manipulation often hide behind the comfortable language of family loyalty, and that recognizing that pattern early is the first real step toward protecting your own peace. It shows that justice doesn't always require revenge. Sometimes the truth, given enough time and enough patience, exposes itself far more powerfully than anger ever could. And it offers something many viewers quietly need permission to hear, that setting a boundary with the people who raised you is not cruelty, it's self-respect, and it is often the very thing that finally teaches them how to treat you with the dignity you deserved all along.